Hello, welcome to my stream tonight. Starting a little bit later today. Tried to give myself a bit of a breather. I don't know if you've ever been in that scenario where you have like afternoon meetings back to back to back to back. That's how the 7:30 start felt on my streams generally. From finishing up work and then dinner, hanging out with the kids, putting them to bed, and then like running here basically to get the stream started. So today I took a moment, gave myself a little bit of time to get myself ready. Never seem to actually be ready on time, but you know, that's how these things go. Anyone who's joining me here, why don't you say hi in the chat? Introduce yourself before we get started. Oh yeah, I'm kind of excited to do the stream tonight. A little bit, I wouldn't say nervous, but like this is one that I've known that I wanted to do for like quite some time. Hi. It's obviously on Marko, which is another JavaScript framework, but it's not any JavaScript framework. It's obviously the one that I do at work, and you know, I got into Marko after I'd created Solid, so it's kind of you know, a bit of an interesting story, at least from my perspective. I wasn't here for Marko at the beginning, right? You know, I wasn't there, so I kind of had to piece together what I know from talking to the other guys, and they're definitely more experts than I am. But you know, Marko is kind of incredible, and I think it kind of is been worth more attention than you know it's gotten over the years. So I kind of want to look into those origins a bit and talk about how Marko is today. We'll talk a little bit about Marko in the future, but I think what Marko's doing already, you know, today is already quite amazing when you kind of put into the context of the whole JavaScript ecosystem. And I think it's even a little bit hard to appreciate given where things are today. So we're going to explore through that a bit and just kind of do a very introduction overview of Marko, you know, where it's been, where it is, and where it's heading. That's kind of the rough plan for the stream today. So hopefully you guys enjoy. I know there's going to be people like Dylan who is from the Marko team, so I've got to make sure I represent properly. He knows a lot more of the details than I do, so he'll probably correct me anytime that I say something wrong. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. But yeah, let's first get started talking about this week in JavaScript a bit. I'm going to share my screen here and get started. All right. Let's share, and I'm going to go switch over to Twitter. A few things happened in JavaScript this week. Last week was all about Solid. We did the 1.3 release and whatnot, and launched that hackathon, which I'm just gonna plug again for a moment because you know I can. If you haven't heard about it, we have a very long-running hackathon, like a 3-month one, $12,000 in prizes, different categories. Do check it out. I didn't really plug it on the last stream, and I was told by other members of the Solid community that I should have done that. So, you know, this is exciting for us. I think it's a real opportunity to build out the ecosystem and show people what we're doing, what we can, you know, what we're capable of. But yeah, it's a quick plug for Solid Hack. But you know, back this week for me has been a lot about Marko, and I'll go over that in a minute. But there's been a couple other interesting things that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, which you already see here on my screen, is Astro is now the Astro technology company, and as you know, we love Astro, and this is big news. They were able to raise $7 million seed round, and I think it's all well deserved. When you consider the potential what Astro has, it lets people use all their existing technology and be able to build faster, smaller websites. I think Astro is amazing, and I think this is a really cool thing to see happen. We see these open source projects. Remix a couple months ago get similar money. They kind of take kind of the meta framework level further. We haven't seen the same kind of investments on core frameworks. But meta frameworks are definitely a business towards it because it gives like the fuller polished experience. And I think it's really exciting in terms of Astro. The other thing for me, I guess, this week, let me go to my profile. There's some quick in my views, but JavaScript, state of JavaScript survey is up. So do try and fill it out. I understand that might be tricky. I had a hard time. It is very buggy this year. I had to refresh like 3 times to get it working, but you know, it's important. You do it. Projects you care about get good visibility, and more than just that, you know, you don't have to choose your favorites in here, right? Well, the best thing about this survey is almost everything has a free form field where you can fill as many options as you want. So, you know, take your time, think about it, try to give credit to like anyone you can think of, you know, that you appreciate the projects and the projects. I'm really happy this year that Solid was actually in the short list. So it was actually one of the preset options. So people didn't have to find it in the freeform field, which is awesome. You know, after the whole, we managed to, I didn't mention this last week, but we were number 5th in front-end frameworks for most stars this year. So I guess we're starting to get noticed. So I'm pretty stoked on that. But hello. This stream is not about Solid. This stream is about Marko, but I just wanted to kind of point that out. So yeah, what's been going on with Marko, right? We had a really good week, and that's part of why I wanted to talk about Marko today, because honestly, we've had a string of really cool announcements the last little bit here. Let me go. Oh, I didn't. Let me. What? It's always like advertisements sneaking into my feeds here. What I want to find is, yeah. First of all, we released from Marko template with Vite plus Fastify, which was pretty sweet. So again, just straight up write this in your console. You get bootstrapped with a Vite Fastify project. This doesn't use the standard Vite Fastify plugin because Marko has a lot of specific stuff around bundling, which we'll get to in the stream. But super easy way to get started with Marko. Another one I'm super excited about was the Vite Cloudflare one. This one I worked on a bit myself too, because I've been really stoked on getting showing Marko on the edge, as you can imagine. And again, this template is pretty cool. You can just install it, command line, same deal. Dylan was actually doing a little bit of some more experiments on here. Added a different form of file-based routing and stuff to kind of make things nicer. We actually took this and took my Hackernews demo that I keep on making again and again on every platform, and we released a Cloudflare Hackernews demo, which we'll look at a bit later for comparison. It's really cool to see partial hydration and streaming at the edge here. I think I mentioned in one of my retweets that I think this is the first template that people can just go out and use and have both partial hydration and streaming at the edge. So really exciting stuff. And the other thing, which kind of brought around the stream, was Pierre, Fireship was asking what the most underrated open source libraries out there, and a number of libraries and great projects got mentioned. But he made this retweet mention that Marko was definitely the most underrated framework of all time, and I feel like that's pretty accurate. He mentions that most people never heard of it, yet it powers eBay's front end, and it's been doing partial hydration and streaming since 2017, if he recalls correctly. And actually, it's actually since 2014, even longer. And we'll go a bit into the history today, but it's one of those enigmas for people because it didn't really break on the open source side. It's been open source the whole time, but it didn't really break as much as other projects. But people in the know what's up. Again, this is one of my favorite quotes from Dan Abramoff, where he said, I haven't looked too closely at Marko, but this 2014 article describes mechanisms that are ahead of what most mainstream solutions, including React, do in 2020. He wrote this in 2021, so I think he was trying to prepare for the potential of them releasing React 18 in 2021, and he didn't want to get misquoted. He's pretty clever on that. But here we are at the beginning of 2022, and this is still kind of true. They've been adding some of these features to React since 2018. but it's kind of crazy how much like this is a lot of the stuff Marko is doing is actually stuff that even predates Marko. It's older techniques that kind of found their way into JavaScript frameworks much later. And yeah, this is both the best testimony you can get from Marko, but this give you kind of perspective of where Marko, might have been surprisingly, undervalued. So yeah, that's what made me want to do this stream now. I've been trying to, think of how to approach it, but this was a great little thing going around. The other reason is I think the conversation has kind of come back around here, right? On these sort of topics, right? Like Astro, which we already mentioned today, is all about islands and partial hydration and sending less JavaScript. And another great one that I saw this week was Justin Fagnani, the creator of Lit HTML. He was talking about Google's internal framework Wiz, which also is basically kind of 0 KB JavaScript framework. And admittedly, I haven't looked at Wiz myself, but I've heard about it several times before, talking to Misko and Igor and various members of the Angular team. And they always kind of point back to it as like this kind of thing that's like, and it's kind of nasty and hard to use ergonomically, but it does when it needs to. And it was very innovative for its time. And he's saying how he wants to explore these techniques with Lit, right? And basically, it kind of started a conversation with myself and Misko a little bit about it, because Alexis, one of our community members, was like, well, Quick is clearly very based on the same idea of Wiz as like lazy loading stuff. How does Marko fit into this picture? And that's part of what I want to kind of answer tonight, right? And I was mentioning that there was like a fundamental difference in that Marko was never really about lazy loading. It was about we're instead of making a framework which would figure out how to best eventually load JavaScript, Marko had a different use case at eBay, where most of the shop front page is mostly actually static and there's only a few points of interaction. That Marko was more focused on just figuring out how to send the least amount of JavaScript, period. So instead of figuring out how to find the right ways to defer and find the right interactions to load that JavaScript, Marko instead focused on syntax and compiler to figure out exactly what JavaScript needed to be in the browser automatically. That's kind of the hook for Marko, right? And I was kind of talking about that, right? That Marko never really initially cared about lazy loading. It was more just about figuring out how to send the absolutely least amount of JavaScript. And this led to a little back and forth with Misko, who was like, DX is important, but if you start with DX, you get a suboptimal performance. I disagree with that somewhat. He is right if you only care about DX. I was trying to explain that with Marko, it was a look at syntax and compiler analysis, which I guess is kind of nowadays considered a DX first kind of approach, instead of looking at like loading mechanisms. Ultimately, in a lot of cases, the difference between Quick and Marko are like they become the same thing. But essentially, the final take or nuanced point of this conversation was that current framework syntaxes unintentionally hinder startup times by preventing decomposition and lazy loading. Quick tries to make minimal changes to that syntax to get what developers are familiar with and allow them to do this decomposition and lazy loading. And you can see that they did some announcements a couple of weeks ago where you can see what that looks like. They have JSX and they have like these kind of wrappers around the render function and event handlers and their components that lets them identify the key granular points to break apart with their compiler, but it lets you mostly author things the way you're used to. Marko, which is a little bit older, which we'll get to, took a completely different choice. It was like, what if we just controlled all the syntax and designed the language exactly the way we needed it to be to do our task? And that's the premise. That's the difference. So with that, I think is probably a good point to kind of switch over to our topic for today, which is obviously talking about Marko. But I want to kind of like dive back a bit. I did that last stream when I was talking about petite solid or petite view. I was mentioning that these are techniques used in the 2010 time period, but I want to kind of you really need to get back in time to really understand the perspective that this was coming from. So let's do that, right? Let's kind of go back in time, and part of it is obviously talk about the technologies that were available at that time, but another part of it is actually talk about how people were and what the perspectives were, coming into this time period. Because Marko was created, to my knowledge, in 2012-ish, internally at eBay. Really, if you look at Marko's timeline, it's very similar to React. But we live now in sort of a post-React world, is my best way of kind of putting it. React, I don't know if there's ever going to be another React, essentially. It came up at the right time with the right technology, and essentially even like most of tech Twitter and like the communities and stuff we know today around front end were built as part of that wave of it growing. Like it's so big and influential even today that it will be a very long time before that would ever not be felt. Even if React fell out of favor, it's made probably a permanent impression on things. So where I'm getting to here is just to kind of actually, if you go back to 2012, 13, 14, as people had been building classic websites using .NET and Rails and whatnot, these server rendered websites, and they were heavy and bulky, and they sucked for interaction. They caused these full page reloads and whatnot, and it was kind of brutal. I still call my time in .NET the dark ages. And when JavaScript became a viable option, we wanted it more than anything to be the solution. We pulled more and more stuff in the client, and it felt so good. Like every time you got rid of those like heavy back and forths and stuff, and you had more and more stuff in the browser, it just made your whole life feel easier when you're building really complex stuff. People wanted mobile apps basically in their web browser, and like the tools we had weren't really set up for that. And that mentality kind of is what React grew out of. And I mean, the thing is, these days, everyone's talking about SSR and partial hydration and being, good web citizens and using the platform and all that stuff. But go back even a couple of years, and that wasn't the sentiment. I said myself quite often that, when I built Solid, I didn't care about SSR. Client-side rendering was fast enough, But now I'm here, big proponent of partial hydration, and it's not just, me. Like it's not just stuff like that. This was like the whole community. Here's a quote that I came across in December because Sunil retweeted it again. But I'm not calling anyone out. I just want people to understand how different things were even 5 years ago. This is Michael Jackson, the creator of Remix, which we all know is a big proponent of just using the platform. As literally the only thing server rendering is good for these days is SEO and search engines that are not Google. That's it. Which, that's pretty heavy. Right? Because I'm sure he probably wouldn't say that, and I'm probably taking this message out of context. Yeah, people think it's their answer to their performance problems. It's not. SSR alone doesn't solve performance, but Remix is a big champion of progressive enhancement, and as I said, it's not just me. It's not just Michael Jackson. How about we just saw Justin talking about how he wanted to bring Wiz into lit HTML, right? This is web components. Mr. Use the platform himself. Right? Again, I'm taking these quotes out of context, but I want to kind of emphasize Marko came up in a world very hostile. When people ask me why Marko isn't more popular than it is, I only have to kind of point back at understanding how much people did not want to be based on some kind of server rendering technology. So this is 2018. So like, can you picture even a few more years early when everyone's on that like React honeymoon, what it was like? I know I was there. Honestly, something like Marko is probably the last thing we were looking for. So why Marko though, right? I mean, we've heard the rhetoric a lot more now, and I was actually I was doing like a presentation for eBay a little while ago, and I'm just gonna share this one slide here that I think is kind of relevant. No, not share, damn it. just present it here for a second. I pulled this off one of Adios Mani's articles, the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is I pulled off something else. I could probably dig it up, but essentially they were saying in the cost of JavaScript article that the median web page loaded 350 kilobytes of JavaScript back in 2017. I think that number has actually gone up, but on a low-end mobile phone like a Moto G4, that can take up to 15 seconds to be interactive, which is a lifetime. Yeah, we started at 8, so you haven't really missed yet much. We're just getting into Marko. I like to kind of give a rant on the This Week in JavaScript before I get into it. So, that's a lot of time. And then the thing on the right, which is how much of a user drop off you have based on how many seconds it takes for your site to load. So if you look, 1 second, 2 seconds, minimal amounts, 3. Once you get above 3 seconds, 24%, 38%, these are considerable drop-off amounts, right? And now picture you are an e-commerce site and you're trying to get referrals off Google search results. And your site takes, it doesn't take much, 350 kilobytes of JavaScript for the 13 seconds. Your site takes 4 seconds to load on that. You're losing almost half your customers before they even bought anything. And these numbers are not unique. You'll find them all over the web. And eBay has their own internal numbers, which I can't share, but essentially picture being one of these companies with like a Java, the classic, server backend, and you need the move to JavaScript. That's where things are heading, but you can't risk, losing that time. And people come to me and they'll be like, oh, but Amazon uses React and blah, blah, blah. There's a system around it. Google had Wiz, eBay made Marko. I'm sure Amazon has some kind of micro services, lazy loading mechanism that they're doing it, even if they're using React. And probably the core static parts of the page aren't doing that, because this is a death sentence for e-commerce. This is why Quick and Builder have been doing their thing, with more modern tooling. But this is not going to work for you for a lot of things. So one of the things, and actually it also matters where you are around the world, right? I didn't actually show this earlier, but I actually love this little tweet. The response to Michael Jackson's tweet about SEO from Sunil was, India would like a word with you. I'm not saying internet is terrible in India, right? But the thing is, not every network is built the same. So you have a slow network, it's a big deal. I hope so. First input delay is a better metric. And the reason it's a better metric is because if you just do lazy loading, you cheat the metric, right? If you just go, oh, I'm not going to load any JavaScript until you click something, and then you download your 1 megabyte when the first person clicks something, you're just cheating the benchmark. And this is our biggest thing we have to watch out for with these new frameworks and stuff, because lazy loading alone isn't enough of a solution. Most frameworks, and this is what Misko was talking about in terms of the decomposition and the structure, most frameworks they have to hydrate top down. This is like React, Solid, Svelte, like you name it. We hydrate top down. And for that reason, if you have a button nested way deep on the page and you built your whole app as a single app, and you click that button, you might not need to bring some other leaf nodes off, but you're bringing the whole freaking trunk down the wire. So, depends on what you're doing. It's fine. I'm not going to tell you not to use other frameworks. I wrote other frameworks, but I want to be kind of understood that, like from eBay perspective, 2012. I mean, you got to remember, JavaScript wasn't even a real player until about 2008. Like, yeah, there was Ajax in the browser, but that's when around 2008 is when like Chrome, V8, WebKit, Safari, and like what was in Mozilla. I'm trying to remember. The modern was it SpiderMonkey? The modern JavaScript engines came out, and they were a big deal because like the performance was like 10x what was before. That's what enabled Node to finally be a real thing, and which came in 2009 right after. You have to understand, for enterprise and bigger companies, betting your backend on JavaScript seemed risky, right? So if you're going to make a large company move from Java to JavaScript, you better know what you're doing, right? And that eBay had to really like prove out this concept. Marko was released in 2014, but I believe it was started building back in 2012. It took a couple years. Kind of, it's a bit of a different story than React, and that's because React mostly was like kind of a layer on top of the PHP. Marko, right from the start, was a replacement for the backend. So, and I'll get a bit more into how and why, but this is also from that article from Adi Osmani and the real cost of JavaScript. And here's the problem. Even if you have the same size asset, right? This asset is half the size of the medium page size, the 170 kilobyte. A JPEG, yeah, sure. So on our slow network, it took 3.4 seconds to send this asset across. But the image took 0.064 seconds to decode and 0.028 seconds to rasterize or paint on the screen. The JavaScript took 2 seconds to parse and 1.5 seconds in execution. To be fair, browsers have done an amazing job to make this better now. But my point is, the bytes aren't equivalent. This it doubled the time. It was 3.4 seconds across the network, and then it was another 3.5 seconds to parse and execute on this device. So you're essentially doubling the time that it takes to do work here, just because it's JavaScript. The JPEG, this doesn't even add to 100 milliseconds, put together here. So like essentially, the image costs the network time. The JavaScript costs twice the network time. So this is a real concern, right? Like, they go on. Him and Alex Russell wrote a great article in 2017. Can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now, but they basically suggested you should be really aiming that first page load or whatever to be in the 80 kilobyte range, right? Like that this is sort of the mentality, at least, that bred Marko. This one, there is execution at the bottom of this chart. It's 2 seconds to parse compile, 1.5 for execution in this example. So yeah, it's basically double with parse and execution. But I mean, that's obviously going to vary. But essentially, where they started was, okay, I need to make a node backend. So this is very different. React was like, how do we make our web experience like a mobile app? That's why they created it. Marko was like, how do I make a node backend? So go back in time, and it used to be called Jade, but have you guys ever seen Pug? Let's see if I can find Pug here. I want to actually get Pug template. This isn't fun. Do they have a REPL? Your homepage is supposed to be like a nice thing showing your actual syntax. Like this is nothing. There's really no basics Pug example. Okay. Pug was a Node language where it was basically like white space matters. You got to remember this was a thing back in the day, but essentially you could just write your div and this would like turn into HTML. This was probably one of the most popular templating languages in the early 2010s because it was very concise because you wouldn't have to you wouldn't have to write like brackets. Yeah. Yeah, nunchuck's another good one. Well, the one that eBay was really interested in was the one that was used by LinkedIn at the time, which was called Dust. And less people know about Dust. I didn't know about Dust, but Dust was special. See, Dust.js by LinkedIn. Dust was special because, okay, it looks like what they're saying is, yeah, I don't actually know what they're talking about here, but Dust didn't have the nicest syntax, to be fair. But what made Dust special was it was really pluggable in terms of these little widgets, which again, you can get that with handlebars and whatever, but it allowed you to put async stuff in your template. And I wonder if I can find an example of this, right? Because there's a lot of syntax stuff here. Partials, block and inline partials. What's a partial? Partial is probably their name for like injecting stuff. Advanced topics. Compiling, rendering, no. I'm probably not going to find it here because honestly, Dust API. I'm not a master of Dust by any means, but just in case you're wondering, Dust was LinkedIn's templating language, and the cool part is that they let you put async stuff inside the template, and the reason is Dust was the only Node templating language that actually supported Node streams. So it would actually stream the data, and then when you hit something async, you could block it, and then, or it could. I think it could. I can't remember if it can fork it, but it could actually process the stuff and then stream it all out as it finishes, essentially, which is really cool because most server rendering, and it's still true today. You go pick up Next.js. I mean, before React 18 or any of that. Remix or whatever, you just do all your data requests, then render it, then send it back to the browser, right? There was even a while, and I was in this crowd where I was like, oh yeah, client-side rendering is faster than server rendering because you can start loading the assets and start doing stuff preemptively before the server even finishes. And to be fair, that's only really true in fast networks and with bigger latency to your database, perhaps. But essentially, Dust allowed streaming, which is basically one of the core tenets or features in Marko. And it's getting more popular and attention now. But essentially, this is where they started. But they realized that Dust really wasn't going to do everything they wanted for them. And that's really where Marko started from, right? You got to understand that at this time period, people were still mostly rendering their templates on the server, right? They were using something like Pug or Dust or something, and then they would add JavaScript to do stuff. The earliest JavaScript frameworks were just like Petite Vue or Petite Solid, which that I was showing off, last time, or Alpine JS. They were these little apps that kind of got embedded on your server-side page and added interactivity. Almost all of them were able to parse HTML to create their templates and do their work. But now, this is where things diverged. Essentially, React and Angular and those frameworks started doing more and more client-side rendering, and Marko stayed on this path. So that's kind of like our history lesson. Let's actually look. Let's actually take a look here at Marko, I think, because we should kind of get a feel for it, because I think one of the most maybe thing that might repel people about Marko sometimes is the syntax. And I think you need to get into that mindset of Pug and Dust to kind of understand where Marko came from. So let's take a look here. Marko, if you've been to the homepage, HTML reimagined, that's as good of a description as anything, but it started from this templating language. And for a lot of times I think someone actually put in a quote somewhere this week as response that Marko was the Pug of 2020. And in a way, maybe that's a fair judgment, but Marko does so much more. It's easy to see how that gets kind of blown over. But essentially, we have some Marko here that looks kind of like normal HTML. And let me blow this up a bit. Sorry, wrong window. Let me blow this up a bit so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But this is what Marko looks like, right? It's single file components. Again, remember this is from like 2013, 2014 time period, right? Nowadays, single file components are like commonplace, and people are used to this kind of ease because it's Svelte. But Marko predates Svelte by several years. So just kind of put that in perspective, essentially, that this is part of why Marko might be underappreciated or ahead of its time. It was doing this compiler stuff way back in the day. So yeah, basically HTML, and then it uses tags for control flow. So if you have an if statement or for, it actually uses tags for them. There's some interesting syntax that I'll discuss in a minute, but essentially, and you can even tell the interpolation using stuff like $, which again is pretty standard in our tag template literals, but this is more of a kind of holdover from, say, Pug. And then on the right side, we got like an interactive example here. Essentially, in Marko, to have state, it uses a class. There's different syntax that we've introduced this summer to do this in a different way. But talking just classic Marko, this is their single file components. You make a class, you give it some methods, use it in the template. Pretty straightforward in terms of that. But Marko has some great features, right from 2014, as mentioned. Streaming, which you can kind of already see how maybe this could lend to a better experience when you have lots of pieces that kind of load in. And the biggest thing you should notice about this image is look at the image, the time that it takes for this image to load. Simply by being able to start loading the asset earlier, even though the page finishes at the same time, the thing that streams the content sooner has the advantage even on total load time. And then the other big part with Marko, obviously the selling, is the ability to send the least JavaScript. But those are all selling points. Let's just kind of, I'm going to dive into an example in a minute, but I wanted to kind of show one more thing because I'm not going to use it. Remember I mentioned Pug? Marko has concise mode, and honestly, I'm past my white space matters days, but it is definitely kind of gives you that feeling of the time period in which it was brought about, right? This started as basically a server templating language. You just wrote your HTML, or your Pug template essentially, and then you're like, oh, I want to do some small bit of JavaScript. I'm just going to put a class here, and when you click on it, it'll do the thing. So that's like the starting point. They were like, okay, if we can stream HTML, make it non-blocking, and just produce HTML as fast as we can, then all we need to do is take this class and this click handler and send it to the browser. And then now our app is interactive. It's starting from a place where all you have is HTML, and you just go, oh, now I'm just going to add some JavaScript. That's kind of the root of Marko. So I already showed some links to getting started templates. We can probably dig into one of those. I'll dig into the Hackernews demo in a minute, but I'm just going to quickly pull up the Try It Online right now. I say quickly, but clearly my internet connection is not playing nicely with me. because that's interesting. Not built for mobile. Okay. Let's see if I can blow this up. We actually have a new try to online with the new syntax, but I want to use this one because it has examples. Let's see if I can blow this up a bit. All right. Okay. So this is just some basic Marko syntax just to kind of get a feel for it. In Marko, you can put JavaScript literally anywhere in your template by just putting a $sign in front of it. So even though it's a single file component, it's super, super dynamic. So, and in this simple example here, it's just showing that, based on this array of colors, and I think I can just edit it. It will, can I change the color? Can I add a color? Orange. Yeah, it will basically iterate over this list with the for loop. And if the colors dot length, basically, if you've used JSX before, this idea of using components for control flow actually might seem weird to you. But on the other hand, if you've used like suspense or error boundaries, it's not too far. If you've used solid, this should be fairly much more similar. But the key bit of syntax that I wanted to kind of show here is, unlike most single file components, Marko uses basically has the same as render props in React, where you can pass props from the parent into the child body here. So in a sense, this color is almost like a callback function. I know other frameworks have different syntaxes for this thing, but this essentially works on basically any component. If you want to build a component that takes a function, if you're thinking JSX, you can do this in Marko's templating language. So it's kind of an interesting templating language in that it started as a server templating language, but it's one of the, because of the dedication to syntax, it's one of the few ones that actually has most of the flexibility that you find in JavaScript. You can even make multiple components in the same file. Hi, welcome. Yeah, just kind of introducing some Marko syntax, just kind of get a feel for it. I understand this is not everyone's cup of tea, but I just wanted to kind of show, because the syntax actually plays a really important role in terms of analysis on the server, because Marko controls the control flow, because it knows this is an if and knows this is a for. It can look at this template and be like, oh yeah, well, here's a static array. This array never changes. So we know that we don't need this for loop in the browser, because it's never going to change. Essentially, it can look at what's stateful and whatnot and make that kind of decision. The heuristic in Marko might be a little bit simplistic because it just looks for classes, but essentially you get Astro partial hydration without making islands manually. If you ever use Astro, you can go, oh, client visible, and then go, oh, this works in the client, or, and you load in these components in your template. Marko, you actually just build an app from scratch, and then you don't really think about it, and then it just automatically does what Astro does, but actually maybe slightly more, because it's not when you enter the child framework that suddenly you have to bring all the JavaScript. It's when you actually do something that needs JavaScript. So you probably don't know what I mean. Let's bring up a real example. I got a Hackernews example. I was trying to find this blog site I made when I first started, but let's look at the good old Hackernews, because this demo has been worn out to I made it with Remix, I made it with Solid on stream. Let's look at what a Hackernews demo looks like in Marko. So this is not using the latest template. I just grabbed this just so that you can kind of see. This is using Marko Serve. This is like Next.js style routes. But first thing you're going to notice in here is we just got some simple file-based routing. And then in Marko, you don't need to actually import any of the other components or the control flow. So in a Hackernews page, for example, you have, actually, let me just pull up one right now. Or hn, what's it? hn dot Marko.js worker. Yeah, okay, cool. I'll just pull up one of these Hackernews demos. You got a page and you're listing a bunch of stores, right? So essentially, this page that does that, I pull in something from a API. This is just, in this case, I'm fetching from Hackernews API, but this could be some database. Like, we don't really care what this is. You're just fetching in your data. I decide to put it out here. Doesn't really matter. As long as you pass a promise into the template, you can then use an await tag, and this introduces us to another little fun bit of syntax. But basically, in Marko, you have the ability to, and I'm actually going to do it here, to just put an await tag and then put then for the success case and placeholder for the loading place. I believe Svelte has a similar tag. You might be wondering what these @ signs are. This is the other kind of fun bit of syntax. I mentioned how Marko supports basically render bodies, but or so not render bodies, render props. These things basically get mapped to attributes. So, in JSX, you can like assign JSX to any prop on it. Like, it's like you can go, you could have a tab and then or a table and go header equals some JSX. Marko basically lets you use these @ signs to basically make attributes that can be blocks of HTML. Most single file component things use slotting like web components, but this allows for a little bit more flexibility, because essentially, for you React people who are wondering what this is, I'll just write it really quick for you. But essentially, this would be the same as if you had a wait then equals stories, draw some JSX, essentially. Marko has the ability to basically kind of pass in markup to any prop, very similar to like a JSX type framework. So just if you've this is pretty powerful, but it kind of plays out nice because it just looks like HTML. So essentially, here we have this is like our suspense component. I sometimes joke that Marko invented suspense back in 2014. That Dan Abramoff quote, that's sort of what he was kind of referring to, essentially. That in that article that Patrick posted back in 2014, he was basically describing how one would use server-side suspense, which is coming to React this year, but with React 18. But essentially, this is kind of what Marko was doing back in 2014. So this is the component that enables it. And essentially, we see our logic with ifs and elses, and you kind of just build out your page for loop. And then story, we don't import. It's automatically detected in the components folder, and it's just another component like this. Don't really have to build it out. I think anyone can kind of see that this is basically HTML, standard HTML, just littered with some special control flow components. And essentially, we have our app, our landing page. And the reason that I want to show this example is when you're building this, it is kind of a server-centric mentality, right? You could put a database query in this in your API call or whatever, and you just kind of build it out, and then you kind of template it and it renders. And I often ask people when they see Marko, actually let's just build this example. Oh, yeah, it's already running on localhost. Sweet. Let me just pull this out over here. And actually, I'm gonna open this in an incognito window because that's better for us to kind of see this. But I always ask people whenever I show this on stream, how much JavaScript do you think it takes for Marko to render this Hacker News page? We did an API recall, we awaited some async data, and then we basically show a placeholder, and then when it's finished loading, we show the content in it. And if I refresh this page, you should see that. This is a really terrible placeholder. I'm sorry, I'm pretty bad at this, but essentially, you see that loading, and then when we navigate around, you can see my terrible. Like I said, it's like suspense. You can see this pretty terrible placeholder. But you can picture something nicer, with not using my CSS skills. And you might be going, okay, well, how much JavaScript do we send on the page? And the answer to that is a bunch in dev mode. But let's build this for real in production. Run build. Builds our packages up. npm run. Start the node server. And the answer to that, as you can see quite clearly, is we send no JavaScript. And the reason for that is because Marko, there was nothing interactive about what we're doing. In Marko, these links you're seeing are actually links. Like if we go back into our Hackernews example and look, these are just anchor tags with hrefs on them. We didn't bring in a router or anything. This is a old school, in a sense, multi-page app. But streaming makes all the difference, because now, instead of having that flicker of white that drives people crazy, and we can actually show probably even better loading states here, because we don't block the rendering. You get the static content as fast as you would in a client-side rendered app, and then you get the content loading in the way you're used to. You've used Twitter before, right? Oh, this is not going to work here because I'm not logged in. Sorry, wrong window. But if you used Twitter before, you see that little bird come in, the placeholder, you get that experience essentially without loading any JavaScript on the page, because because of streaming, we don't block. We can show the stuff right away, and if data takes a while to come in, it's fine because it gets sent over the same stream. Now, to be fair, this is not 100% zero JavaScript, because this shows the loading spinner in your place, and you're like, well, how the hell would you have zero JavaScript and show one thing and then show another thing? Technically speaking, sorry, not this example. I need to switch back to the other window. Technically speaking, there's a script tag on this page. One little script tag at the end here. It's probably not even 20 kilobytes. Like, there's the whole thing. It just goes, when this content for the page loads in, replace the placeholder spinner. And to be fair, with Marko, you can actually tell it to do it in order. And actually, if you want to see what that looks like, we can get rid of the loading placeholder and go get rid of that client reorder. And this forces it to stream from top to down to bottom. We can actually, let's see now when we load it. There's no loading state this time, but we can actually load the page, and there is actually literally no JavaScript. If I disable JavaScript in my browser, this would still stream in. That's essentially the power of streaming, and it makes a huge difference for multi-page apps like this, because essentially, I mean, this is a bad example because it's like literally just a header that's fixed, but picture your app with a sidebar like Twitter or whatever. You can navigate around, and it doesn't really feel that bad or clunky compared to a single page app. And this is the message that Astro and them have been and Quick and stuff. But the difference with Marko, as I said, is you literally just write HTML like with some stuff in it. You don't go, oh, load this when you do this stuff. Marko isn't a lazy loading framework. It's a compiled framework. So I'm gonna put this back for a moment. But what if you do have JavaScript, right? So let's look at that for a second, because I use a Hackernews example a bunch because, right, I'm not started. npm run start. We do have JavaScript. For example, let's go to this comments page. In this comments page, we have the ability to shrink and hide comments. So obviously there is JavaScript. So in this case, we are loading JavaScript. And in the case of Marko, the Marko runtime in Marko 5, isn't the smallest runtime we've ever seen on the stream, but it's 13.9 kilobytes, and then basically some page specific stuff's about 1.5 kilobytes. So altogether, it's about 15 kilobytes of JavaScript. But what I want to show you is the end user doesn't really worry about that, because when they load the page, this page has no JavaScript, and then so no JavaScript, and then when you go here, it loads JavaScript because it needs that JavaScript. But it's only loading the JavaScript it needs, and I can show this a little bit better here, but I think the interesting thing about that is, have you ever seen what you saw this Hacker News page where we just have this little script to move stuff into place and it streams in? Have you ever seen what this example looks like in a different framework? Like, let's HN, let's pick one. That doesn't really matter. Let's pick Svelte. What do we have? I'm looking for it. Yeah. Okay. This one I guess was built with Sapper. Most of the time, you render in the page, right? Which here's our page, and you have all the articles, the stories, and all of them with their data and all this stuff, and you have this giant blob of data that you need to send to the client to hydrate. So you both send a bunch of JavaScript, and I mean, in the case of Svelte, it is not a ton of JavaScript. What is it, like 13.4 kilobytes? I could definitely pick an example that is less nice. Next.js. I mean, this is like shooting fish in a pond, but you get the idea. Let's how big is Next.js? 121 kilobytes. That sounds about right. And you can start to see, like, this is a world away. Let me see here in terms of like the amount of JavaScript you do in the page, because in Marko you're not going to find those assets serialized to the page, because Marko knows that it doesn't need that data at all. It doesn't need to be stateful, so it doesn't need to send that data to the page, right? And the thing is, but this gets a little bit trickier, right? Because if you go to, say, the comments page, let's go to the comments page here and refresh. Okay, so 13.6, this one's a little bit bigger. Here's our script page with all the posts and all the comments and all that kind of stuff, right? And I don't know if Svelte doesn't do the shrinking, but in the Marko example, we actually have to hydrate this page. But again, there's a bit more data because it needs to basically know where the islands are. Essentially, where it needs the interaction. And this did serialize stuff, but this is much, much smaller because we didn't actually have to send the data. And the key to this is because Marko knows that the async stuff is only they could tell that it's not stateful. It's not driven by something stateful. So it knows that the request only happens on the server, which means it knows that the only data it needs to send is the data that is the input of any components that are stateful. So in this case, unfortunately, you can see all these little empty arrays in this data structure. That's it, Marko going, oh, here's your props components. In this case, there isn't any, so it's an empty array. But essentially, this is why there's a bit of data here. But Marko automatically creates the islands. And the way we did this example did take a little bit of cleverness, because because essentially, let me show you here. When you go to the story page in Marko, sorry, where is it? Pages, stories. No, story ID. It's like the other one where we await our info. But what I did here, we show the story, which we know there's no classes here. There's nothing interactive. And then we loop over the comments. And the comments also are not interactive, essentially, on their own. So we just, again, you don't see any state. The way I did this in this example, and this is a bit like, I don't know if anyone's read Dan Abramoff's When to Use Memo. He talks about solving a problem by hoisting it And that's essentially what I did here. You see this toggle component? This is the only stateful component. It wraps our for loop, which makes sense. It wraps it, right? We can compress all the children, but because we know that this is coming from outside and there's no like render crop here, there's no like arguments being passed in from the component, Marko is smart enough to know that, oh, this is statically rendered on the server. Even though it's a child of a stateful component, it doesn't actually need to pass its state, which means that the comment and all these comment fields are also static. And the toggle is really simple. It is simply a button that changes state. See, on create the state. It's kind of like a React class component. And then when we press toggle, we switch it, right? Marko's syntax is kind of in the middle between React and Svelte, in that you can just do simple assignments, but it's still like a this state kind of thing. So it's like it's basically component level reactivity, where you don't have to call like set state calls, but it still works very much like any other VDOM today with Marko 5. And essentially, we just toggle the display between open and close here, essentially. And because the children are static, it knows that nothing in here actually reads from the comment, which means we don't need the comment in the browser. Now, if I was to do something to kind of fool Marko and be like, we have stateful stuff here in this comment component, our output gets quite a bit different. Now, Marko goes, oh, this is a stateful component, and it reads from some comments. So when I refresh this page now, we're going to see a very different script. We're going to see all the comments serialized, just like Svelte or Solid or Next.js or whatever, because we were doing some stateful stuff in here. So you can't just do this completely dumbly. Like you can't just like put a class and just go blah blah blah. You might be aware of this to a certain degree, but the especially when you come to optimization. But the key part is, outside of these kind of like use memo or type scenarios, you author your code in Marko like it's HTML, and Marko can just tell what not to send to the browser. It's automatic islands, right? And this in Marko 4 or 5, this is a simple does it have a class thing, but it actually holds up pretty well. As I said, this is obviously me kind of playing around with the system, but like your authoring experience is just this, pass in some promises, write some HTML. Like it's hard for me to picture building, especially like content sites or simple websites, like in an easier way. There's no like, you're not going, for the simple stuff, you're just writing some simple JavaScript and basically using a templating language. It's like Pug. You're kind of, and then when you go, oh, I want to add a little JavaScript, that's literally all that Marko does. It adds the JavaScript where you add the little bit of JavaScript. So, I mean, that's kind of like what the authoring experience is. I remember the first time I did this and the feeling, because I was just like making my Hackernews example and I was copying it over, and then I saved it and I ran it and I refreshed in the browser because I was like, okay, I want to see how this compares to Solid. And then there was no JavaScript there, and I stopped and I was like, oh yeah, like I forgot that there should be JavaScript, or it shouldn't be JavaScript. It was kind of like the framework kind of fooled me because I wasn't thinking about it. Like in this example, my API is a client-side API. It's just a Hackernews API. So I never really had to think about it much. But you can understand that this benefit that kind of comes from, sorry, I'm going to rebuild this one again, that with our toggle, sorry, back to normal. This benefit that sort of comes from being able to just author stuff in a very simplistic way and with HTML and just use stuff, makes it really easy to forget that you're dealing with a client server interaction. It's a really cool model, especially because you don't have to import tags like other tags. I'm usually not a big fan of single file components, as you know, but if I'm built I sometimes say that like a lot of these systems aren't built in a way that scales to like complex state management and all that stuff. But the thing is, if you don't need the state management anyways, you know what I mean? Like for person building a blog site or a simple e-commerce store that doesn't need app-like behavior and crazy stuff, this is very compelling. Of course, this isn't the end of our story for Marko. This is just kind of the feel for Marko today, right? And I mean, let me see here. As I mentioned, we actually deployed. Open my other window here. Is it still open? We actually deployed stuff recently to Cloudflare. Where is it? Let's make sure I can. Yeah, you know, and this example is basically the Cloudflare version of it. And oh right, my Grammarly extensions. This is why I opened the other tab. Essentially, you have the same experience right on the edge. Mm-hmm. So we already talked about size. We talked about the kind of Hackernews example. Just to lay in the point before we move to the next topic, just to make sure that everyone's kind of clear on this. What you're saving in the scenario when you have true partial hydration is you're not only saving the JavaScript running on the page. You're not shipping the JavaScript. You're not just saving running the JavaScript. You're also tend to save the double data duplication problem, because you only need the bits of data that are actually connected to the things that are actually interactive on the page. And depending on your site, that can be actually very little. But that's Marko today. We knew we wanted to do a little bit more. Where am I at? We're about an hour in. We're in a pretty good place. Yes, great question. It depends which benchmark you're doing, right? Let's pull out the JS framework benchmark. Thank you for asking, because I'm a big fan of this benchmark, as everyone knows. Why is Marko not doing good in this benchmark? Well, this benchmark only tests one thing. It tests how fast can you client-side render after you've already loaded the page. Essentially, that's all this benchmark works. So I will tell you right now, the fastest client rendering techniques, except for BlockDOM and a few ones that are using these new kind of experimental approaches, are generally not VDOMs. Generally, like there's a few in here. And so there are fast VDOMs and there's still VDOMs, but essentially Marko is very much the product of the front end technique that they used at the time. Because I want to see if I can find it here. But if I remember correctly, Marko and React are about exactly the same place. Where is it? Marko, React. It's not terribly impressive. I actually looked at seeing if I can improve the benchmark for current Marko, because one of the main reasons is for list sorting, it has half the frameworks have a smart algorithm for sorting lists, half the frameworks have a dumb argument for or like a very naive approach to sorting lists. Marko is on the naive side along with React. So those frameworks immediately get kind of sent to the back of the list. Whereas once you get past here, you notice that it's all green. No one on the front of the list has it. So this is a big one. Basically, the gist of the matter is Marko today is not the fastest client-side framework. It's comparable to React. But what if we wanted to look at server-side rendering, which is a different kind of benchmark? Then you have a very different world, because in server-side rendering, it looks more like this. Marko, these are client-side, so this one's the only server-side one. This is actually not, this table, yeah, I'm gonna just, maybe I'll just look at the numbers, it's easier. We need better display for this, but the gist of it is, if you look at the server-side benchmarks, Marko is almost 10 times faster than React or many of the popular solutions. Like it's not even close. I mean, Inferno actually has a bug in their escaping, which is why this is so fast. Inferno should actually be slower than this. They have a security issue. But essentially, compared to most front-end frameworks, Marko is like Vue 9000, easily 3 to 10 times faster. So this isn't, everything I showed you has been about server rendering and less about client-side rendering. And Marko's hydration is super fast. So while on the JS framework benchmark, it's gonna be slow. If we do like kind of the load thing, like what do we got, web dev, slash, was it measure? We all like running these benchmarks, right? Let's go to Page Insights tools. If we do something like this, and you take Next.js and you stick it in here, let's do it. I mean, this is a Hackernews page. This page is basically nothing. It's just like a list of stories. 73%, 1.7, 1.7, 3.9 seconds to interactive. That's not great, right? And let's give them another shot. Let's now add server components with Next.js and streaming in the latest, best stuff. You know, this example probably still needs a little work, but let's do experimental React with Next.js and do the same thing. This is another Hackernews. I have every framework's Hackernews at the tip of my frameworks, right? So 96, it's a lot better, right? Half the time to interact in our classic Next example, but still largest content load 1.8. First content load's not bad. So this is a pretty decent place. Let people like Remix, right? I've got Remix's demo right here too. Let's just run Remix through here. Sorry, I'm burying the lead a bit because I already kind of know how this goes. Oops, something went wrong. Oh, did I copy some extra stuff here? Yeah, let's try Remix again. Right? Remix is a bit better than Next.js, you'll find, but 97. So 1.2, 1.2, 1.2, 1.5. So another 300 milliseconds. They're pretty fast at getting the paint and stuff, but another 300 milliseconds until hydrated. And I blame this on React, because if you sorry, that's the wrong one. If you take like solid, you know, I gotta do it in this order, because if you take solid, essentially, let's see how this one goes. And as I said, we're just taking the first go. Well, those are much better numbers than what we've seen so far. 0.8 faster, zero content, but time to interactive is 1 second. It's still costing us like 200 milliseconds to get interactive, even with solid, right? And how it's felt. Felt's another good one. Let's do this. I literally, as I said, I have everybody's Hackernews at the tip of my fingertips here. This one should be close to solid, but it doesn't stream, so it should be slightly slower. Yeah. So 1.1, 1.1, 1.1 across the board. Pretty good. The hydration cost with solid, as I said, it usually between 100 and 200 milliseconds. Svelte's hydration here actually looks pretty good. So, but again, a little bit slower on the load on mobile. But essentially, in the end, we're both about 1 second, right? Let's take Marko. I've been obviously waiting for this one for last. Let's take the Marko example. Here we go. Quick needs to get in on here too, but to be fair, Quick's going to be very similar to Marko, but let's do quick, or let's do Marko. This should be 0.8s across the board. Yeah. I don't know what the speed index is. I have no clue. But look, first compile 0.8, just like solid. Largest compile 0.8, just like solid. Streaming is awesome. Time to interactive. Like this is the difference. Like, to be fair, when Remix first posted their demo, they took the script tag off their page when they compared it to Next, and their numbers were pretty good. They were pretty similar to Marko here, or Solid. I think they were 0.9, but essentially they were basically the numbers. But the difference is you had to take the script tag off the page, and then on the next page add the script tag back, or like make that decision and do all that stuff. Like Marko, you saw me. You just like write the code, and it just automatically makes things fast, right? You don't even have to like the syntax is the catch, but not anything mechanical. You don't have to like wrap things in special wrappers or do anything special. You just write HTML and with some syntax. If you can swallow the fact that there's some slightly different syntax, like, there it is. Yeah, and that's the whole thing. It doesn't, because it's MPAs are like a different thing. Like, there are trade-offs here. Obviously, I'm selling Marko on its strengths here, but there are different trade-offs with different types of architectures. And the reason Marko doesn't have an easy to use router, well, it's because it has the easiest to use router, the browser. Like, you change the URL and it renders the page, right? Like, but like state management, yeah, Marko is lacking on state management, and I've recently made a GraphQL client for Marko, but it's lacking on like some of the like state management and data service thing, and a lot of that kind of ecosystem. Mostly because primary use case for Marko, which we've been probably terrible at selling people on, is just building e-commerce sites or blog sites or stuff. Like, yes, if you need advanced state management, yeah, sure, you can probably pull X data in and figure it out, but there's not a Marko integration for that, right? As of today, like, essentially, like, there is ecosystem considerations here, but in some ways, it doesn't affect Marko as much because it's a completely different architecture that doesn't lend to those patterns. That's the thing. Every time someone comes in and goes, "Oh, where's the router?" We're like, there is no router. I'm not going to say that makes Marko perfect for everything. I think, and that's what I'm going to talk a bit more about the future in, but I just wanted to kind of show you that just if you care about your page loading as fast as possible, this is for you, right? Should I just go with solid? Yeah. See, some people probably were wondering, like, as I said, I had no qualms as someone in solid, creative solid, coming and working on Marko, because our starting points are on the opposite side. I had a great conversation with Dan Abramoff a few weeks ago on Theo Stream and our Source Space, and essentially he was talking about the left hand and the right hand side. That was sort of his metaphor for this. He was saying that, like, React, coming from the right side and making the apps and these really interactive things, but there's also websites and blogs, and React's kind of making the progression over. And I was like, yeah, and Marko, or these other new frameworks, some of these new kind of MPA frameworks, are starting on the left side. And he was like, he was trying to kind of suggest that React just covered a wider range, and I was like, yeah, you should check some of these out, because they're making the move to the right. Like, both sides seem to be converging in the middle, right? If there's one thing, Rich was dead on when he's talking about transitional apps. There is a convergence to the middle going on right now. These both frameworks on both sides are kind of expand out their capability. We're starting to see MPAs with different type of client routing. So right now it's starting with very turbo links, Rails can influence, but I think where things are going going to be a lot more interesting. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. I want to try and keep this on track on the Rails. But in terms of should I go with solid today, the answer is your application more app-like? Is your application have like a dashboard or has lots of interactivity? I would still go with Solid for that. I would go for Solid on maybe, anything that scales, like building social media or that. Am I building a blog site or an e-commerce site? Like people have different comfort levels. So like I kind of like JSX and I like that feel. If you're building, a small simple site like a blog site, you could go with anything, and especially something small like Svelte or Solid. If it fits your feel, like that 13 kilobytes of JavaScript wasn't really killing anyone. You know what I mean? Whether it's 13 or 0, whatever. But yeah, if you're building an e-commerce site or something where load actually matters, like I wouldn't choose Next.js. I think Svelte or Solid would be fine, but if I had a large site and I knew that I had lots of content and like it was a big thing and my business depended on it, definitely Marko, right? As I said, in the middle, I think we have a lot of choice. That's what's great for us. In the middle, you just go with whatever feels natural. Like personally, if I was building a blog site, I'd probably do, or like a simple like kind of content site, like just being able to edit HTML and have a designer dump that in. I feel like something like Marko seems really, really good for that. But in the middle, none of the solutions are that bad that you couldn't really just choose to go with any of them. But definitely, there are definitely cases where Marko just far exceeds other options. And where page load is concerned, there is basically no comparison. So anyway, let's talk a bit more about where are we right now? 121. Let's kind of go into the next phase here. Marko next. We talked about benchmarks, we talked about performance, we talked about Hackernews. The syntax and everything I've been showing you so far came out in 2017. Okay? The modern Marko that we know came out almost 5 years ago. We released Marko 5, which is a big technology update, but all the syntax hasn't changed. Like the core of it, from the outside perspective, hasn't changed that much. So Marko's had the modern features that we know since 2017. It had them before that, but they had different syntax and different things. But Marko, the future, is taking a slightly different direction. And it's one that I'm actually pretty excited about. We've seen reactivity kind of come over as a wave, sweep over the front end ecosystem. Svelte, Solid, like you know the deal. And I can go back. I find an article from Michael Rawlings as early as I think 2017 or 18. Like they knew they wanted to take Marko this direction, but hydration and this kind of performance is still the biggest goal here. And runtime reactivity is challenging here because runtime reactivity has to run. It has to actually collect the dependencies. Like you run it, then you know what changes. It makes it incredibly dynamic. It's quite likely that Solid's approach to client-side rendering from a pure performance standpoint is not going to ever, I don't want to say ever, but isn't going to be trumped by these compiler-based approaches, just because of the level of dynamicism. And as long as you can optimize memory allocations fine, you can do stuff with nested routing and that would be much more verbose for the compiler and fight against where they want to go. But on the hydration side, being able to use the syntax analysis is something that is very difficult for a runtime approach to handle. Like it's not just a matter of like compiling in the dependency arrays, so to speak. And Svelte actually has a really good approach here, where they basically compile away the reactivity. The problem with Svelte's approach was it kept everything in the single file. Like you can't compose reactivity. You can't like, you can use stores, but now you're on a runtime approach. You can't like use things like hooks. So where Marko wanted to do is they wanted to make their own hooks that worked. We wanted to make our own hooks that worked with compilation, and worked with hydration. And that's essentially where we went. And what we came up with is something called the tags API. And actually, do I have the Marko Twitter open? Using the tags API preview. I'm gonna show the tags API for a moment because I think it's kind of interesting. But essentially, the tags API looks like this, which if people weren't already put off by some of the syntax, but essentially it lets you declare state as variables, state variables. Like instead of using a class, it basically lets you use tags. And while the syntax, might take a bit to get used to, it has an incredible power because it is analyzable. I've written some articles on it. My Reactive article kind of goes into it a little bit, but essentially we know that this is stateful, kind of like a hook. We've denoted it. And what's cool about this is, sure, this is let, but this could be anything. This could be any hook you want. Because it's a tag, we know to treat it specially. We have effects here and most kind of things you expect. Let is basically use state, and const, if you see it, is basically use memo, or in solid create memo. So essentially you can just write reactive statements in your template and then they just kind of work. This is essentially the gist of it. Your templates, instead of having that kind of break into the class components like Marko has now, everything is markup. The for loops, the effects, and even the custom ones. And I go over a lot of it in this article, Context API. But the reason for this is that we can essentially, where I'm trying to find the example here, but yeah, I mean, we can basically make custom tags that have the same thing. Yeah, here's my example I wanted to show everyone. Picture you wanted to make your core signal or data persist in local storage. You see this at the top of every to-do MVC example. So I kind of made this example here so you can kind of see it. Essentially, with Marko Tags API, instead of let, you can now use, say, local. Define your own tag, and because it's Marko, you don't have to import it. Pretend these are two different files. It just finds the local component and lets you initialize the count and set a key, and then you use it just like state. Like if this was let, this would have been the same, right? It shows the count, and when you click on it, it updates it, and it's your typical counter. But local, like a React hook, essentially, it defines these props. In Marko, we call them attributes or attrs, and then essentially we pull when we first initialize this, we pull the value from local storage. It's like solid. It runs once, and then basically it's the expressions that run multiple times. Then essentially we parse out the value, and then we write an effect that whenever essentially our storage key is fixed, but whenever the dynamic part in here changes, we update. In this case, it's our store, which is our let variable, which is just kind of like a signal. And I know I might not be doing the best job of explaining this, but essentially it's like the cross between Svelte and solid. It's fine-grained, compile-away reactivity. It works cross-file, but it has the same reactive semantics as solid. Some people understand like Svelte reruns components. It's not as well known, but essentially when you update something, they go, oh, you need to rerun this component, and they just do this really simple diff to check it. So in a sense, Svelte under the hood works like React, and React Forget is a lot like Svelte, surprisingly, what they presented at that JS Conf, because essentially they just started putting these dirty checks all over the place, so that when things reran and they memoized, they were able to say, oh, only this change, I only need to run it. That's exactly how Svelte works. Where this approach with Marko is actually kind of like if you compile the way Solid's reactivity. Instead of rerunning a component, it actually breaks the component into a whole bunch of different fine-grained reactions, and then through the use of topological sorting, kind of like Svelte, and setting up the execution, it only reruns the reactions that depend on the data. There is a limitation. It's not dynamic, right? It doesn't know if you have a conditional, which side of the branch. It looks at everything that could be tracked inside of this effect, essentially. But it's only this effect that reruns when the store changes. And obviously this one, because this is the store, but just kind of showing you it's compiled fine-grained reactivity. And as I said, on a pure performance level, this probably will never won't quite get to where Solid is in the browser, but we've done some early benchmarks, and I can't reveal the exact numbers just yet, but I would say all I can say is right now the numbers look to be closer to Solid than they are to, say, Svelte, just in terms of where things are on client-side performance. But the key to this is this fine-grained analysis. Sure, that's great for performance, right? We can tell, we can basically, like Solid, it can do even less diffing than most other frameworks, less diffing than Svelte, less diffing than React or Vue or whatever. But the real secret here is because it knows the fine-grained data dependencies, it even knows better what can change, right? And this allows for something which we've been kind of talking about as subcomponent hydration. And I'm going to explain subcomponent hydration in just a minute, but before I'm going to, because that's kind of the future here, I wanted to show you, because the tags API is available right now as a preview demo, and you can install it. But if I go try it online new, you can actually just, we're going to release this, but this essentially is our playground, our new playground, and we can just let me see here, div. We can just do it right in here right now. Div and Marko, and what was it? Or should we make a button more semantic? You can use the tags API right now in Marko. It has some. I've been really enjoying some of the new syntax, like this shorthand. So one of the coolest things is it's super concise, but essentially the authoring experience of it is, I think, the real win here. And I actually had an example again from this presentation, and I posted on Twitter, but I feel like this makes it like way more obvious. I mean, we've all kind of been here before. You want to write everything in the framework the best way you can, but sometimes you got to bring in that jQuery chart or something. And the thing that I didn't really impress on anyone yet about the tags API, which makes it so powerful, it's the same with Solid, and this is the power of fine-grained reactivity, but it's easier when you have the syntax in a sense, is that because everything runs once and components aren't a real thing, you can put state wherever it makes sense. So this example is kind of a great example of that. I hope everyone can kind of see, because I don't think I can't make this slide much bigger, but essentially this simple example we show, pretend you have something. I don't have the address tag in here. This is from a slightly older demo, but essentially we're getting a reference. Again, we're using the tag variable syntax to get the reference out for this element. And what we're doing here is we're getting a reference to this div, and then this mount hook is kind of like on mount and Solid. We actually currently don't have this in the tag API. You could just use an effect, but you essentially on mount, when this component mounts, you create a chart, with the ref to that element and some input data, say that you pass into your component, and then you return you return the cleanup function. So this is just kind of like use effect in React. The exact, and you can see on React, the exact same code would begin, declare an element, create this use effect, which is very similar, set your empty dependency array, and then draw the stuff in here, right? Draw it in the and as I said, I'm using this kind of effectful thing because it's always easy to really emphasize the difference from React by using effects, because the effects APIs are always the clunkiest examples. But jQuery, third-party chart library, we got the ref. Now, new requirement comes in. What do we do if we have to conditionally show this chart? Like if we basically need to go, oh, only show this chart if there's a prop for make it visible. And we've all done this with React, I'm pretty sure. What we'll do is we'll put some extra logic inside our use effect, and we'll set a dependency there. And then maybe we'll add some conditionals around the logic and stuff. So let's look at what it looks like in React. I'm going to focus on this side first. So first, now we need to tell if we're enabled, and then create the chart, and if enabled, and then do maybe optional chaining to tell like if the chart's been enabled, release it, and then make the thing depend on the chart. And then, we will mount our element based on whether it's enabled or not. So basically, if you remember that old React hooks example where they showed a class component, and when you had to change something, you had to change in like 6 different places because the colors were split, like the different concerns were split all across your template between the life cycles. Marko's taken that a step further, so to speak, because in Marko, if you want to make the chart conditional, you literally just wrap it in an if statement. And all the life cycles and the refs and the internal state all will be handled simply by the fact whether this mounts or not, because components don't matter here. You don't have to have hook rules or any of that kind of garbage. To be fair, this is identical in Solid, but you could see how much simpler this is in a certain sense in Marko, because in Solid, you have to go back into JavaScript land from the JSX to kind of do this. You have to go, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to define my effects. So if you wanted to do this if statement thing, you would still most likely have your effects like React at the top and your JSX at the bottom. So you would probably still, you wouldn't need this array, but you still probably write some logic like this, even though you could nest it, doing some tricks in the JSX. But with Marko, because you use tags, you're more likely to have put the effect next to where you authored it. So this sort of if statement just does it. And while this looks like 2 changes, if you think about it, you probably just typed the if and then cut the whole block and inserted it. And in my original example, although I don't have a highlighted version of it here, I took this and was like, what happens if you wanted to actually split it out into a different component? And again, with Marko, you could just cut out this essentially and stick it in a different component and then put the component in here. And with React, you'd have to almost refactor back to the original version and then wrap the component with a conditional. So it was like, it was way more maintenance. Essentially, by using markup, it's kind of like using HTML. You create a cut and paste editing experience for maintainability. So it's not just write less code now, which is like this svelte thing. I'm definitely playing off that. It's actually write less code in the future. And this is something that is like a superpower of fine-grained reactivity. But as I said, because of Solid's templating, we don't really leverage it as much because you still tend to write stuff this way with separating. But with the Marko Tags API, we expect that people will have just cut and paste WYSIWYG refactor stories, essentially, because they'll just they'll co-locate their stuff. So essentially, it's like the next step of that components are pure overhead story that I've been telling people for a few years, because essentially with React, you chose to break components up based on how they effectively work. There's a performance consideration. That's why this whole React memo thing is, React forget is happening, because if you don't break up components, you'll over update. Like if you put a for loop inside a component that has other state, and that other state updates, it's going to rerun the for loop when that other state updates, right? That was the whole React forget example. A framework like Svelte is kind of on the opposite side, most reactive frameworks, because they don't want you to make components, because components are their effects, essentially. They're the things that rerun. So the more of them you have, the more memoization, the heavier they get. So essentially, they're like, don't use components as much as you want. The bigger you make your templates, the better. Fine-grained reactivity basically makes the component not a consideration. I know it's not about performance. It's about not letting performance dictate how you organize your code. And when you take something like this approach to templating with Marko, it's taking it even beyond that. It's not only that that you get to choose, how you break up your components, and components have no effect on your performance. You can just do it however you want. With Marko, this approach, it's more of like, components have no effect on how you structure your code ever. Like in Solid, for example, you'll still probably decide to structure it like the React way. So while components don't really matter, you'll just do whatever makes sense. But maybe down the road, there'll be a bit of a refactor job you have to do. With Marko, refactoring is not a concern. Okay, so that's the selling point on the tags API, on the ergonomic standpoint, because it's all just tags. But where the other big side of this is where it's getting on the hydration story. And the hydration story is really powerful because we can analyze granularly what's stateful. And that means that we can effectively split a component into multiple different pieces. And I actually covered this in my compiler stream towards the end, if you want to see it. So I'm not going to go too much in details about this topic, but what that means is, let's see, did I have another example up? No, I didn't. But yeah, let me see here. Maybe it was, no. Yeah, okay. Maybe there's a good example in here. Essentially, we can look at those dependencies. It was the const example I was talking about, wasn't it? When I was talking about this earlier. Yeah, I mean, this is as good as anything. But essentially, we can track and know, based on what's stateful, which things depend on it, using basically a fine-grained reactive graph. So you can picture, if you had a component, if you have a component, essentially, you pass, and the parent passes in data to it that is static, we know, like in our maybe I'll pull up this silly example again, but like even in this example here, if input enabled is set to true or never passed in from the parent, we know that it can never update, which means that we know that we don't actually need to send the JavaScript to be able to render this div or whatever. Like, essentially, on a per binding level, based on the inputs being passed into the template, based on the dependency graph across files, we have the ability to know exactly what could update and only send that part. And the way Marko's doing that is it's actually compiling these components into like a bunch of separate components. You can picture, yeah, you know what? Give me 2 seconds here and see if I can pull it up. I did show this on the previous stream, so I'm just gonna see if I can pull this up out of my Google Drive again. If I can find it, because I'm pretty sure I grabbed this talk from Michael. I saw it a little bit earlier. Give me just a minute. Man, I have so many of these talks. This is my fault. I should have prepared this one. I wonder if I have my stream notes from last time, compilation notes. I might actually have it. Yes. Thank you, Ryan. Yes. Thanking myself from the past. All right. Let's spend a couple minutes talking about this one. I'm just gonna. This is the key on the hydration part, right? Find the component. Most frameworks, when you have to hydrate something, you find the component boundaries, re-render the component, basically, or in the browser. You don't re-render the div, but you compare what was rendered to what was server sent, and then attach the event handlers. Where all we want to do is find the button and attach the event handlers, right? This is a lot of work that can be avoided if we can make our hydration resumable. And this is kind of the selling point on that Quick's been going on. But the thing is, there's lots of ways to make your hydration resumable. Most frameworks aren't set up for it, but there are different ways to do it. And I've been showing this counter component. This should kind of look familiar to you now. And hopefully people who watch the compilation stream before aren't going to be too concerned about me going over this again. Maybe it'll make more sense now, right? I already showed what a tag variable was. We show the count, we click on it, whatever. But Marko compiles it into multiple different exports. The component actually becomes granular. And this is actually very, very similar to Quick, except our granularity, Quick goes, here's the event handlers, here's the view code, here's like the component state code. Where Marko splits, well, the templates here, the view code, this is some encoded walk thing in terms of how to walk through the elements. This is actually like element first child, next sibling encoded. But it's something Marko splits the code paths between stuff that needs to be rendered in the client, stuff that needs to be hydrated, and splits those by like inputs to the template. So everything is split fine-grained. We don't just have like a single state. We actually have not only split out the event handlers, which need to be added during hydration, but we actually split based on each separate input so that when the parent imports it, parent can go, oh, am I from its own analysis, am I passing static data? If I am, I know that I don't need to import the dynamic version of the code, and we can actually tree shake it essentially as our ability to do this. So essentially in this example here, for our button, which is a completely stateful client-side component, we can have a render function, essentially. This is like the client-side render, which basically initializes a count to 0, essentially. So going back to our example, this is let count 0. And it calls hydrate. And when you render in the client, what you do is you initialize it with the value. It does write, which is kind of like a dirty check. That's what this if is. And if it is, update the div. But if we were rendering this on the server, we wouldn't call render, we'd call hydrate. And all hydrate does is add the click handler, which is here. And it doesn't actually need the other code, essentially. And Michael actually kind of shows this in this example, essentially, because when you call hydrate, essentially you need the click handler, you need the ability to set the new count, but we don't actually need the code for the template. We don't need the code here for the walks, and we don't need the code for the rendering. And this is kind of like our default export for the component. It's not that important, but we don't need that either. And while this seems like a bit of code, when you minify it, we actually, on this very, very simple component, shrink the component in half. This is a stateful component too. This is like a class component today in Marko. We've shrunk the component in half on something that's stateful. If it wasn't stateful, the whole thing would be gone, right? But this is just a normal stateful component. But because nothing really re-renders, we just update some numbers and attach a click handler. We're able to use our analysis of the reactive graph to actually split the component code down to 50%. And that example is just showing that if you send static data in, then we could even like remove more stuff. But my point is, for a stateful component, because we break things up into these imports, I mean, this is a simple stateful component, but you could pretend if you had two different states coming in from the parent, you could choose what to actually import and actually tree shake parts of the component out of the compiler. So this brings up a really good question, actually, which was, what about reducing data sent to the client, like you showed with adding class the Hackernews? Will this be able to consider the tags API? Yeah, that's the thing. With the class component, we always had to serialize the inputs coming into the top level components. The approach that we're going to take with hydration, with the subcomponent hydration, is a little bit more interesting, because it's not guaranteed to send less data, but it only needs to send the data that is read in an effect or in an event handler, because those are the only things that need to be essentially ran in the browser. So we have the initial state in whatever signal we initialize, right? If we did need to handle it, but essentially what we can do, and this I don't have a good graphic for this to explain, but essentially the memos or consts or whatever, like the derivations that run on the server don't need to rerun on the client if their inputs aren't stateful, essentially. So we have this ability to prune off parts of the reactive graph and not send them to the browser, and serialize only the data closest to the stuff that's actually being used in the browser, which means that this is a huge difference from something like Quick, because Quick hydration is very similar to this. They just have the event handlers, and then when they go and hydrate, they just go, here's all the event handlers, and then when you click that button the first time, it goes and loads all the code. But let's forget about the code loading aspect. Let's pretend it was already there. Like they knew this part of the page was a place you used. They then rerun their components. So hydration resumes, but execution is like a BDOM. Like you rerun your component code and you generate it. With Marko, because it's fine-grained and we serialize the data closest to where it's used, we can actually resume from the middle of the component. Like we don't have to rerun the component. We've already calculated the derived values. Like, how like in solid, like if you update, if you have a computed or a memo, sorry, you have a memo and you have another signal and they're read in your view, and you update that signal, even though it calls both functions, the memo doesn't run again. Like you've already calculated that value. The memo only reruns when that value is changed. Marko, and it gives that really fine-grained updates. Marko 6's approach here basically lets you resume fine-grained updates like that from server rendered code. So it's more than resumable hydration. Like the term resumable hydration is being kind of thrown around right now as like, basically not redoing work from the server at hydration time. But Marko actually doesn't redo work from the server on update time either. In my mind, that's actually true resumable hydration, but I mean, it's hard to say. As I say, Quick's already kind of taken that term, so it's always kind of hard. So more truer resumable hydration, but essentially the idea here is Marko can literally resume where the component left off. It's not like just don't do any work at hydration and then re-render the component when something updates. It's like literally render the component with as much information as you know, send exactly the minimal amount of data you can to the client, that you need. And then when the component updates, only rerun the small separate little things that actually update. Don't rerun any components. So yeah, like this is pretty crazy stuff. We don't have this completely yet. We're working on the first demos of it on the client side, and that's kind of Marko we're kind of like building the alpha now. We're past the prototype stage. We've proven this out. We're now essentially in the process of building the first version of this and building the compiler. But the runtime approach seems to work pretty well. So hopefully that answered the question about the data reduction. I'm not going to say the data reduction's less than we have now, but it enables crazy ability. And we haven't talked about async, and async's a little bit more complicated, but what you realize in this approach, and this is the real clincher here, is if you serialize the data closest to where you use it, and you don't rerun the component when the component loads in the browser, you don't need a cache to resume. Like one of the biggest challenges when you do like isomorphic fetching is that you fetch it on the server, and you get the data and you serialize on the page, and you fetch it on the client, and the client goes, you don't want to fetch on the client, but when you hit the code to fetch it, you go, oh, it's okay, I already have this data, don't fetch it. And that's basically how Solid works right now with its resources, and it's very common. You basically precede a cache so that you don't have to fetch again on the client, and then you now can hydrate everything with that data. In the Marko case, because that data fetching is how should I put it? It's before you get to the event handler or the view. Its output, if read by the effect, like close to the fact, that's what gets serialized. So when it goes to run in the browser, it knows not to rerun the async function because it's going to be in the render function. It's not going to be in the hydrate function. So we don't actually have to send the whole cache. We can actually just send the data that's used in the event handlers and the effects, and be confident that we're not actually going to refetch because it's outside of that scope. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, fine-grained reactivity is the key here. I mean, this is a large part of how I ended up working on Marko. I was spewing all this stuff about Solid and fine-grained reactivity and about the no component overhead and all this stuff. And Michael and Dylan were like kind of like, that's it. Like we weren't sure what the solution would look like, but they're like, this is the answer to the hydration problem. Essentially, like basically fine-grained execution semantics. The problem was we actually kind of played around with the idea of bringing something like Solid in, and it probably would have made development, like Marko 6 is probably already out if we went that way. But the ability to, we wanted this resumable hydration, and it's hard to do that with a runtime approach. But it's hard to do a compile time approach with fine grain unless you have the semantic execution. And this is why I've been talking a lot about the language of reactivity, because I believe with the language of reactivity, the ability to compile is infinite. Like you can describe the intent very well through the language. And even React has talked about how they're used as like a language and it does have a lot of that similar compilation and analysis. Like if in Solid we forced everyone to use like a prefix, then like we could probably do something similar. But there's different paths to take here, which actually brings us into maybe the last and final section of our conversation today, which is, sorry, just making the banner. It doesn't matter how much more time I give myself. I'm never ready. MPAs in the future. This is even more futuristic, because right now with Marko 6, which should be coming out this year, definitely have alpha beta. I don't know if like the final release, these things take time. People expect that now after, how long React 18's taken. So I don't feel as bad saying that, but these things take time. Where do we go from here? Because I'm basically showing the way that we could have the most optimal compiler analyze partial hydration combined with streaming. Like this is pretty incredible stuff from a technology standpoint. And as I said, we got kind of deep dive on the technology here, but the authoring experience, as I showed you, is just use some tags. So guy who makes his blog site and just writes HTML gets the benefit. But I think there's a bigger question here, and Rich Harris kind of posted it to me a while back, because he was like, but ultimately no one actually really wants an MPA. We want client-side routing. We want that flexibility. We want that ability. And this aspect is not lost on Marko or the Marko team and stuff. Like, obviously you can add client-side routing. I think I mentioned that was kind of like a trend in December, where a bunch of frameworks like Quick and IOS started adding turbo-like routing, or just experimenting with it. But that's generally clunky. So where this goes is, I feel that MPAs will have some form of client-side routing. As I said, for your simple apps, I already showed you. Like, I'm all about apps and like interactivity and JavaScript and all that kind of stuff, but like the blog site or the content site or whatever, like you're not really suffering from having the MPA. But I said that side, the Marko Quick side, they are trying to approach the center too, right? They want to do more app-like things. I think the way this is done and the way we do this definitely involves client-side routing. And what that looks like, we're still obviously figuring out. But I think the key part about it is, how do you swap the HTML from the server, yet keep fine-grained updates, right? React server components have to come in this conversation, because they are sort of a version of this coming from the single page app side. And for something like Solid, I imagine that's where the research will go, because I don't think we'll ever be able to compile like Marko does. It's just this is incredible stuff, honestly. And these guys were already like on this track to a certain degree, like they were on it before I even joined the team. But for the Marko side and the MPAs, I do think there is an interesting convergence, because I think client-side routing in an MPA that is resumable like this, that is hydratable out of order like this, essentially will want the ability to hydrate a button or a section of the page when you click on it, and then choose when you interact, say, with the router, to load the router at that point, and kind of be able to navigate to a new page that is server rendered, but not necessarily, wipe everything out. Obviously, when you go to a new page, you can just wipe it out with HTML and we don't care, right? But pretend you're on a search page, like everyone's favorite search page, whatever. Not favorite, but this is an MPA. You can tell very minorly. The page reloads. You can tell because of the way the browser interacts, but it doesn't really, like, what if we wanted to, I mean, this maybe isn't even the best example, but what if we wanted to persist elements underneath the part that changes? And I think that's going to take a different type of approach, one that we haven't seen yet. It's not turbo. What we need a way of actually perhaps fine-grained even, be able to send updates from the server with the new content, but not necessarily replace all the content HTML that's already there. And just how that works, I'm not sure, but I think fine-grained has the tools, and that's the research that's going to go into. As I said, I think it's possible that everyone is actually going to be looking for the same solution. This is my prediction part of the show here, but I actually think there is obviously VDOM libraries like React have an angle, but the solution for non-VDOM approaches to this might be the same across single page apps and MPAs. So Dylan and guys on the Marko team have some really good ideas here. This has been something that I've been racking my brain about. I think that's the next really cool thing. I want to see more projects trying to make things like server components. I want to see different types of routing that are smarter than like XHTML or turbolinks or whatever, approaches, in non-VDOM things. I think that's the gold rush. As I said, for Marko, the focus first is this ability to, because once you have this, you can just build upon it, because you're sending the least JavaScript. You know that you have the most efficient hydration. You know that you have the ability to load JavaScript out of order. But it's going to be interesting to see what other kind of solutions or how you can build upon this, in this space. I think that's the future. I think MPAs still are going to be good for the majority of apps, but I think you're going to see MPA frameworks come at the single page app frameworks. I think the convergence is real. Transitional apps is real. So I'm excited to see what that looks like. And we always have to remember, like those quotes I showed you from big proponents of SSR and use the platform basically saying it was useless a few years ago. What we think we know now might be completely wrong in a couple of years. So, take it all with a grain of salt. But it seems to me that would be a really interesting and fun thing to research into. And it's definitely something that has my attention now that I've got streaming and Solid, and I've kind of finally finished the story of Solid having React parity. And Marko, as I said, when Marko 6 comes out, we're going to see the state of the art on MPA stuff. At that point, I don't know. Do they meet in the middle? This will be really exciting. But I definitely am very interested in all the technology being developed. I think Quick's got part of the answer in there. I think Astro's client visible and like their very simple API, I think while it might not be the best solution for partial hydration, like in terms of like how granular it is, it's a good solution for lazy loading. And I think that in the future, we're going to need to separate lazy loading and partial hydration boundaries. There are things that it doesn't make sense when you get super granular on partial hydration. You don't necessarily need to be super granular on lazy loading. Sometimes you just want to save the work being done in the browser, but it's okay to ship a little bit more of the JavaScript, because the last thing you want is someone clicking a button and having to now it loads. Like, that's why Google probably is looking at changing the metrics. It's hard to measure this, but we might have a middle zone before we get there where people are essentially, how should I put it? Essentially just turning off the script tag, so to speak, and then loading it lazily. There's a lot of ways to do really poor lazy loading and score good on Lighthouse. And my biggest fear is we're going to see that. We're already seeing, not that, but we're already seeing the 0 kilobyte JavaScript banner being raised by frameworks that essentially aren't partial hydrating, right? They're like, well, look, we can do 0 kilobytes of JavaScript because it's progressive enhancement. So, and I'm like, yeah, every framework can. You just remove the script tag. But the difference is when you add the script tag back in Astro or Marko or Quick, you don't bring all the JavaScript with you. You just bring the stuff you need. Where in other frameworks, popular frameworks, it does mean that it's binary. Do you mean server-side rendered islands? Yeah. This whole conversation is kind of about islands. Marko just makes islets. It makes the smallest possible like the smallest possible islands, and it does it automatically. So yeah, so this partial hydration and islands are kind of like the same term. So when I'm talking about islands and islands, like when I'm talking about this routing solution, I'm talking about client islands inside server islands, like, and different parts of the page being replaced with server chunks, and then still being able to reintegrate those client parts. This is pretty complicated stuff, but I think, like React, like for a single page app and server components, the way React is going is probably the right sort of research. I want to see what that looks like outside of VDOM, but I think the convergence is happening there on server components. As I said, I've been critical of server components because to me they don't actually solve they're good for this, like the initial load is not their win. Like just going to server components with React, like that alone, like doesn't solve like the same stuff as partial hydration. Like that's not going to make React good at e-commerce. Like if just because you have server components, you haven't suddenly like solved that. But it is good for scaling large applications. There's a lot of applications for server components, and I think there might be an opportunity for server component like things to actually be decent enough for something like e-commerce if done with a small enough framework and done in a smart way. So I am interested to see how that works. Does Marko provide anything interesting on data mutation, remix, and forms cool again? We don't have a built-in. Dylan actually made this the other day. We took it out of the template because we didn't standardize on it and we didn't want to be too opinionated. He's got the code if anyone's interested. He completely remade he saw remix and he was drooling. He was like, man, if this just wasn't React, it was like he's like, this is how I've always wanted my stuff to work. So I don't know if we're going to publish anything about that, but he does have the code to do this kind of magic form mutation that works perfectly in our Cloudflare template. So yeah, we'll see what we can do about that. It is definitely very nice to have this mutation story. And obviously with something like Marko, which is already just use the HTML, like forms are the way you should be doing things, right? Like it makes sense for the model. And so like this was a no-brainer. We don't have an official solution, but yeah, I mean, we will. Like it's pretty obvious thing for us, and we already actually built it, so it's actually surprisingly easy to build. So yeah, okay, that is actually most of the content in the stream. I talked about the futures of MPAs. I talked about Marko. I talked about a whole bunch of awesome stuff. So I'll field a couple more questions here while I finish my Long Island, but other than that, I'm good to call this one. I hope this shorter, more focused stream approach works for people better. I start a little bit later at 8 o'clock because, as I said, I get more time for myself. But yeah, I'm pretty excited. This is all going to be posted on YouTube and whatnot. But yeah, it was a good stream. Thank you everyone for joining me tonight, and hope gained a little appreciation for how incredible Marko is, both from just an authoring experience standpoint and from a technology standpoint. And hopefully, you'll give it a consideration in the future. And, as I said, go to the the State of JavaScript survey, look it up. I know it's buggy. Go in there, give Solid a nice nod, and go type Marko in the box. It does autocomplete. The survey is aware of Marko. So give us a shout out in the survey, get a little attention for both the projects. I'd definitely appreciate it. And actually anything Astro's in there, just support the projects you love. Please do fill out that survey. And what's the term here? Like, comment, subscribe. We'll see what we do next week, but until then, have a good one and enjoy your weekend. Have a good one.